Good afternoon, boys and girls. How are you all today? I got a lovely surprise today. I got emails from lots of the children and some photographs and videos. So it made my day. So thank you to all those boys and girls that sent those in. I was really happy. Today our story is Mr. Messy, our 8th book. Mr. Messy was the messiest person you've ever met in your whole life. He looked messy because he was messy in everything he did. You could always tell where Mr. Messy had been because he left a trail of messy fingerprints wherever he'd been. Oh yes, Mr. Messy was messy by name and messy by nature. There are all the fingerprints. Mr. Messy lived in a particularly messy looking house. The paint was peeling, the windows were broken, there were tiles missing off the roof, the flower beds were overgrown with weeds, the garden gate was off its hinges. And had Mr. Messy cut the grass in his garden lately? He had not. I think he needs to do some housework. One morning, Mr. Messy woke up in his messy bed, yawned, scratched, got up, cleaned his teeth, leaving the top of the toothpaste off, had his breakfast, spilling cornflakes all over the floor, and then set out for a walk, tripping over a brush he'd left lying in the garden 2 weeks before. Oh, he doesn't look happy. He has a sad face. That's what happens when you fall, isn't it? You get a bit upset. There was a wood behind Mr. Messy's messy house with the messy garden, and that's where he went for his walk. It was a particularly large wood with lots and lots of trees, and it took Mr. Messy a long time to walk through it. But he didn't really mind because he felt like walking this morning. So he walked and walked right through the wood until he came to the other side. And do you know what he found on the other side of the wood? Maybe he found a playground, or maybe he found some friends. Mr. Messy found the neatest, prettiest, lovely looking little cottage that he had ever seen. It had a lovely little garden with a stream running right through the middle of it. There was a man in the garden clipping the hedge. He looked up as Mr. Messy approached. "Good morning, I'm Mr. Messy," said Mr. Messy. "I can see that," replied the man, looking him up and down. "I'm Mr. Tidy." "And I'm Mr. Neat," said another man, appearing out of the house. "Tidy and neat," said Mr. Tidy. "Neat and tidy," said Mr. Neat. They're good names. "We're in business together," explained Mr. Tidy, "and the people who own this house have asked us to do some work for them." "What sort of work?" asked Mr. Messy. "Oh, we make things nice and neat," said Mr. Neat. "Tidy things up," added Mr. Tidy. "Perhaps we could come along and do some work for you," said Mr. Neat, looking at Mr. Messy, who was looking even messier than usual that particular morning. "But I don't want things neat and tidy," said Mr. Messy, looking downright miserable at the thought of it. He liked to have a messy house. I'm quite surprised at that. "Nonsense," said Mr. Tidy. "Fiddlesticks," said Mr. Neat. But, said Mr. Messy. "Come along," said Mr. Neat. "Off we go," said Mr. Tidy. But, said Mr. Messy. "But nothing," said Mr. Neat, and bundling him into their van, which was parked behind the house, off they went to Mr. Messy's house at the other side of the wood. I think he's going to owe them a big fee after fixing up his house. "Good heavens," said Mr. Neat when he saw where Mr. Messy lived. "Good gracious," added Mr. Tidy. "This is the messiest house I have ever seen in all my born days, they both said together at the same time. Better do something about it, said Mr. Neat. And before Mr. Messy could open his mouth, the two of them were rushing here and there about Mr. Messy's house. Mr. Neat hoed and mowed and pruned and snipped and clipped and cleared and dug and made the garden looking neater than it had ever looked before. Wow, that's a really great job. Mr. Tidy cleaned and primed and rubbed and painted and mended and made the outside of Mr. Messy's house look tidier than it ever looked before. Then they both went inside the house. Good heavens, said Mr. Neat for the second time that morning. Good gracious, said Mr. Tidy for the second time that morning. And then they set about cleaning the house from top to bottom. They brushed and swept and polished and scrubbed and made the inside of the house look neater and tidier than it had ever looked before. They're two very kind men. They're helping Mr. Messy a lot. There we are, said Mr. Tidy. All finished, said Mr. Neat. Neat and tidy, said Mr. Neat. Tidy and neat, said Mr. Tidy. Mr. Messy just didn't know what to say. I think he should say thank you. What do you think? Yeah, I agree. He should say thank you. Then they both looked at Mr. Messy. Are you thinking what I'm thinking? Mr. Neat said to Mr. Tidy. Precisely, replied Mr. Tidy. What we're both thinking, they said together to Mr. Messy, is that you look much too messy to live in a neat and tidy house like this. But, said Mr. Messy, I think they're going to brush his hair. Let's see. Oh, this is very exciting. But whatever Mr. Messy said was no use, and Mr. Neat and Mr. Tidy whisked him off to the bathroom upstairs. It had been the messiest room in the house, but now, of course, it was as neat as a pin. Then Mr. Neat got hold of one of Mr. Messy's arms, and Mr. Tidy got hold of the other arm, and they picked him up and put him straight into the bath. Mr. Messy wasn't used to having baths. He looks so grumpy. Baths are great fun. He might like them. Mr. Neat and Mr. Tidy washed and brushed and cleaned and scrubbed and combed Mr. Messy until he didn't look like Mr. Messy at all. In fact, he looked the opposite of messy. He looked at himself in the mirror. You know what I'm going to have to do now, he said in a rather fierce voice. Mr. Neat and Mr. Tidy looked worried. What will he have to do? I think he'll have to change his name. Let's see if that's what he's thinking of. What are you going to have to do? They asked Mr. Messy. I'm going to have to change my name, said Mr. Messy, and then he chuckled. And Mr. Neat and Mr. Tidy chuckled, and then Mr. Messy laughed, and Mr. Neat and Mr. Tidy laughed, and then they all laughed together and became the best of friends. And that really is the end of the story, except to say that if you're a messy sort of person, you might have a visit from two people. You might if you're messy, and they might get you to clean up. You know what they're called, don't you? We do. One of the men is called Mr. Neat, and the other man is called Mr. Tidy. So, boys and girls, to finish today, we are going to sing There Are 10 in the Bed. That's our new song for today. So I'm going to move the camera because I have 10 things set up. So I'll just bring this over here. You can see there are 10 things on the bed. So here we go. There were 10 in the bed, and the little one said, roll over, roll over. So they all rolled over, and one fell out. There were 9 in the bed, and the little one said, roll over, roll over. So they all rolled over, and one fell out. There were 8 in the bed, and the little one said, roll over, roll over. So they all rolled over, and one fell out. There were 7 in the bed, and the little one said, roll over, roll over. So they all rolled over, and one fell out. There were 6 in the bed, and the little one said, roll over, roll over. So they all rolled over, and one fell out. There were 5 in the bed, and the little one said, roll over, roll over. So they all rolled over, and one fell out. There were 4 in the bed, and the little one said, roll over, roll over. So they all rolled over, and one fell out. There were 3 in the bed, and the little one said, roll over, roll over. So they all rolled over, and one fell out. There were 2 in the bed, and the little one said, roll over, roll over. So they all rolled over, and one fell out. There was 1 in the bed, and the little one said, I'm sad, I'm sad. And he went down to join his friends. Hooray! So boys and girls, that's the end of our song and our story for today, and I will see you tomorrow.